Unlike other world leaders, it's been announced in Israel on national television more than once that Prince Charles is a descendant of King David. While that's true of William and Harry as well, for example. So that's one criteria that the two of them would meet, unlike the other criteria that pertain to his father in relation to the Antichrist. You don't see that announcement, and I haven't heard of that announcement for any other world leader, just Prince Charles. And the only way that announcement could be made on national television in Israel is if there's a rabbinic community behind it who are looking at the British monarchy potentially as the source of the Messiah, because obviously they reject Jesus, Yeshua as the Messiah, most of them. I'm an exception, right? I'm a Cohen by birth, meaning I'm a descendant of Aaron, Moses' brother. I'm a Levite. I believe there are, a couple 100,000 people like me in the world who are Israelites who do. But most of Israel still does not believe, including Israel in the land. And yet, so they're looking for somebody to be the Messiah. They think this is the time in history soon when the Messiah has to show up. Many rabbis do. And so this announcement's been made for Prince Charles in Israel. That's a big deal. And until recently, meaning the last few years, Prince Charles had never visited Israel in a formal capacity, only informally. For example, to see the grave of his grandmother. She's buried in the Mount of Olives, or that kind of thing. For Shimon Peres's funeral, for example, because Peres was knight of Prince Charles and involved in this false peace process type thing. But not too long ago, at a Holocaust remembrance type event, a big deal one, in Israel, in Jerusalem, I believe it was Jerusalem, world leaders gathered to give speeches on the Holocaust. And that was Prince Charles' first formal visit to Israel. And he gave, flat out, one of the best speeches ever on the subject of the Holocaust, and denouncing it and so forth. The person who gave the next best speech after Prince Charles, oddly enough, was Vladimir Putin, if you can believe that. And so Prince Charles really ingratiated himself to the nation of Israel with that speech. And people can look that up online. It was actually a really big deal, and it was a fantastic speech. So that being said, the really weird thing is that right after that speech, Prince Charles skipped all the group photos. The other world leaders participated, including the other speakers. Prince Charles skipped them, and instead, he went to meet with Abbas and the so-called Palestinians to push the fake peace process and the division of Jerusalem. That's what he did immediately following speech. So he went from ingratiating himself to the Israeli populace to literally stabbing Israel in the back and pushing the division of Jerusalem. In the long view of history, God deeded the whole promised land to Israel, and that would be from the Nile River to the Euphrates River, bounded by the seas, meaning not just the territory that Israel is in today, but all of Lebanon, all of Jordan, much of Syria, all of Saudi Arabia, all of Yemen, all of Oman, all of Qatar, etc. All of that land is part of Israel's promised land. The Muslims know it, and they believe that the promises, rather than going through Isaac for all that territory, they know what the boundaries are. They believe that the promises went through Ishmael rather than Isaac, because that's what it says in the Quran. Israelites and Christians would say Muhammad tampered with the Torah, the 5 books of Moses in the Old Testament, to make it look like the promises went through Ishmael, also Abraham's son, rather than Isaac and then Jacob being Isaac's son. Isaac and Ishmael both being sons of Abraham. So the Muslims think that land is deeded to them, but Israel is saying, no, it's deeded to us. And of course, Christians are saying, well, Israel, you're right, it is deeded to you. But at the same time, there are all these prophecies in the Old Testament where God told Israel, if Israel was unfaithful to him, that he would kick Israel out of the land. And you can read, in fact, for example, in the latter chapters of the book of Deuteronomy, as one example, the curses that God said he would bring upon Israel, and he would allow Israel's enemies to bring upon the nation if the nation was unfaithful to him. And among those were not just being kicked out of the land, but even the equivalent of the ovens that Israel suffered in the Holocaust. I mean, there's literally nothing that Israel has suffered in history, including in the Nazi Holocaust that's not actually foretold just in those 5 books of Moses in the Old Testament. Most people don't realize that. So while God has deeded the promised land to Israel, until Israel is faithful to him again, Israel doesn't have a right to the land any more than anyone else does. In terms of Prince Charles and the Muslims of the Middle East, he is the most prominent Westerner, bar none, of any Westerner on the planet among the Muslims in the Middle East, and particularly the royal houses of the Middle East. And not only is he the most prominent Westerner, but he also converted to Islam behind the scenes under what's called a guardian, one of the most prominent Sunni Muslims in the world. Not a lot of people realize that. So Prince Charles, while claiming to be a quote-unquote Christian and being in line to one day be head over the Anglican Protestant Church, is also a Muslim behind the scenes, wants to defend Islam, not just Christianity, quote-unquote, but also Judaism and Zoroastrianism and Hinduism and paganism in general. He wants to defend everything.
Well, this is very, very important, isn't it? Because he's supposed to be taking over as the head of the Church of England, but he has himself said that he will not be the defender of the faith, where we have had Christian monarchs ever since King Alfred in 880 AD. This is whatever it is, 1,200 years of Christian monarchs. He's not going to do that. He's going to be the defender of the faiths.
Well, Prince Charles has an honorary doctorate in Islamic studies from a university in Cairo, Egypt, which is actually the most prominent seat of Islamic learning in the world, Sunni Islamic learning. So he has a doctorate in Islam. He is the most prominent Westerner from the entire world among the Muslim Middle East. And he is a Muslim converted under one of the guardians behind the scenes. And, oh, by the way, he's also an Hashemite, same lineage as Jordan's King Hussein in that sense, meaning he supposedly descends from Islam's prophet Muhammad. All that adds up to one thing, which is that Prince Charles could step in one day and say, I'm your Mahdi to the Muslim world, to both Iran and Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Muslim world. Besides, this rabbinic community behind the scenes in Israel looking at him potentially as the Messiah. So I want to come back to one thing here. I've said that the Muslims are going to successfully attack Israel. They're going to take half of Jerusalem by force and war in a few years. We're going to see the wars break out with North Korea and Iran. I expect to see Russia take advantage of that, probably take Ukraine at that point rather than now, but we'll see. And perhaps go after other portions of Europe at that time. I expect to see China take advantage of that and go after Taiwan. I expect to see North Korea go after Japan in conjunction with all that. And we may even see destabilization at that point between Pakistan and India and see them jump into the fray. In other words, we will very quickly be in World War III. Something will happen where the nations come together enough to agree to take half of Jerusalem captive in war, meaning Israel will be successfully attacked. The rest of the world, through the UN, will get on board with that and say, hey, you can go this far, meaning you can take half of Jerusalem, but we're not going to let you go further than that. We're going to stop right there. We're going to put Israel back into that box of the 1967 borders, for example. And then the Great Tribulation will begin, or the 2 witnesses will begin to torment the nations of the world, where the Antichrist will receive a mortal wound and recover from it. In this case, Prince Charles, where that statue to Prince Charles will be erected in a newly constructed holy place on the Temple Mount that does not currently exist. All that stuff is going to happen within the first 3.5 years of the final 7 years preceding Armageddon. And that 7-year period gets kicked off with what Christians have referred to as a peace treaty involving the Antichrist, this prince of Roman lineage of Daniel 9, verse 27. What Christians have misunderstood about that treaty, they've always assumed, most Christians have, that the Antichrist would sign it, and that Israel would sign it, and that Israel and her adversaries would agree to it and be on board with it. That actually is not what the verse says. What the verse says is that this prince of Roman lineage will impose the treaty. He will enforce the treaty. And it will be imposed, in other words. The nations of the world will agree to the imposition, but it could be imposed on Israel. It could be imposed on the so-called Palestinians, and dividing Israel's Jerusalem by force and dividing Israel's land further and taking a portion of it from Israel, and then saying to the so-called Palestinians, okay, this is what you're getting, and to Israel, this is what you're getting, and then trying to enforce that. That is what actually the treaty is about. And so the nations are going to agree to do something like that, and they already are, more or less, by the way, just not in a formal way, to divide Jerusalem. Israel's not going to agree to it. Israel's going to refuse. The so-called Palestinians are not going to be completely on board with it. There are going to be things they're not happy with, like maybe the right of return type thing that they're demanding. And it'll all be imposed, 3.5 years later, where half the city of Jerusalem be taken by force, etc. Then the Great Tribulation begins. Then the Antichrist starts his 3.5-year reign. So that's what's coming, in a nutshell.
How do we make sense of this as it unfolds?
Right now, I would look for the wars to begin with North Korea and Iran. We could also look for that treaty to precede that, some actual formal agreement among the nations that says, we are going to proceed with something along the lines of dividing Jerusalem, rather than just saying, this is what we want to see happen in relation to Israel and the so-called Palestinians, meaning to force that fake peace process forward.
Now, it seems to me what you're painting is a sort of man-god who would put themselves out as the great peacemaker, even though behind the scenes they've been involved in creating the wars in the first place, which, doesn't look entirely unlike Adolf Hitler. It's just a much more kind of smiling, friendly version. Anyway, Tim Cohen, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you. Please look up my book, Antichrist and a Cup of Tea, on Prophecy House's website.